through line of inheriting trauma that I have made for the Reclaim and Opal and Octavio narratives in return from There. I want to start off with some reflections before we get into the lesson. I want to explore, what do you know about Native Americans? I realized that before reading There, my perception of Native Americans is outdated. I have seen them as a people of the past. Although I know that Indian reservations still exist, in the back of my mind is a thought that they wouldn't for long. I've thought of them as people who don't exist because there aren't people that are running around wearing feathers and doing tribal dances. This perception is wrong because they are still here and they're not just in reservations and they're not just wearing feathers and loincloths. There knocks down my prejudices and enables me to see Native Americans as a people who are rich in history and should not be forgotten and even more so misrepresented. We'll be analyzing the characters of There through the term exile. It's a term from post-colonial theory that is defined as retaining a sense of belonging or longing to or for a real or imagined world. The characters in There walk on lines of binaries to their identities, and there's a sense of displacement in Oakland that follows them. So the important part about using a post-colonial concept to analyze our characters is, yes, they are Indians, and There fragments the real past of Native Americans from the time of colonization to help us understand how they have come to be what Tommy has coined as urban Indians. There has characters that orbit around a theme of hybridity between their own identities and intersections and being Indian. For them, their longing for a real or imagined homeland from the definition of exile is not necessarily a land that their ancestors had taken from them, but instead in Tommy's story, what they're longing for is the identity of Native Americans that have been erased with a hegemonic history. A quote from There that expresses this feeling well comes from the interlude. Quote, "The fact that we have been fighting for decades to be recognized as a present tense people, modern and relevant, alive." Quote. The characters of There can all be defined by exile in their own ways, but there is one person who inhibits exile by its definition. This character is Orville, who is attracted to Indian culture while he listens to powwow music, researches Indian on his phone, and sneaks regalia out of Opal's closet to wear and dance with in the mirror. So he truly seeks to explore Native American culture, which I feel like can be compared to longing for his imagined homeland. Some of our characters are exiles through their struggles with alcoholism and a longing for sobriety and peace. Others inhabit being in exile through poverty and their longing for comfort and riches and power. Jackie, Orville, Opal, and Octavio had big parts in the chapters we're analyzing, but I also put Dean in this diagram just to show that all of our characters inhabit the space of an exile. Octavio has begun a plot to take advantage of Native American culture by robbing the powwow. It seems he's turned away from being Native based off of the comments he made to Tony about getting, quote, Indian stuff, quote, for the powwow. His chapter does reveal that he is Native when his grandma talks about curses and medicine boxes, and there's a powerful moment when his uncle forces him through a ceremony telling him, quote, "We should be brown. All that white you see that you've got on your skin, we've got to pay for what we've done to our own people," quote. His chapter shows that he's in exile from his native side, as well as you can tell that he never personally explores it like other characters do. With Jackie, her narrative doesn't focus on an obsession of being Indian or not Indian. Her story is an expression of one way urban Indians are seen, which is as an alcoholic. But because of this, Jackie is an exile from family, so she has a longing for family. She knows she should be taking care of her grandsons and mourns the death of her daughter that she was negligent to. Opal's narrative is based on abandonment. Her mother leaves her by death, Jackie leaves her by the mistakes she's made, and a lover even leaves Opal as well. Opal deals with many losses and exiles herself from being Indian as she longs to get away from it because it's become synonymous with bad to her in her life. It's like she blames the sad situation she's in on being Indian. Dean's fixation on being Native American comes from trying to fulfill his uncle's legacy with the film on Native American stories. He's portrayed as an exile when he worries that the Indian judge wouldn't believe that he was Indian and was trying to appropriate the culture through his idea. He felt like he looked more white or racially ambiguous at best. In this diagram, I've also placed themes in the book that thread our exiled characters together. These themes connect the narratives and they're there as they come in fragments. Octavio and Jackie both deal with alcoholism. Jackie and Opal are connected by their past. And Opal and Orville both lost their mothers at young ages. And being Indian is key to Orville and Dean's narratives. And circling back to Octavio, he and Dean are both half Indian, but accept that identity differently. I just wanted to bring up this point right now because it's important to explore why Tommy uses so many pieces to connect our characters. This next diagram shows the themes littered throughout the narratives of each character, and they're there. How does trauma from violence affect them? Or even the trauma of the lack of adult influences, trauma from rape and drug abuse, from the loss of family and poverty, emotional neglect, and mental health. And even the trauma that our characters experience because of how they accept or reject their Native identity, and even how their identity through their intersectionalities affect them as well. Octavio has an antagonistic presence in Tony's and Calvin's narratives. What's important about understanding his past? It seems he never gets the help somebody who loses their family the way that he does should. He's a witness of extreme domestic violence when Manny, his cousin, has to attack his father because his father is abusing his mother, causing Manny's father to be hospitalized and then kicked out of the house. So with moments like this and what has happened with his uncle, which we'll detail in a bit, he's not just a bad guy anymore. He's a boy who does bad things, probably because his life has been made up of bad moments. The trauma from the violence he experiences leads him down a dangerous path and redistributes his trauma onto others through violence as well. So, in regards to his Uncle Sixto, how he basically caused the death of his father because stealing the drugs and causing the drive-by shooting, and then being the sole survivor of a car crash that he created that killed his mother and brother. And the trauma that I'm talking about that Octavio redistributes is the way that he treats the rest of the kids in the neighborhood. As a drug dealer, he's more powerful than them. They all have this sense of fear towards him, and he's giving Tony a gun. And now he's looping everybody into this plot to do a robbery on the powwow. Jackie has trauma from violence by rape. She never reported Harvey, and she and Opal never reported Ronald. Her trauma is left unresolved as she tries to remedy it with alcohol. And the problems from her alcoholism end up infecting trauma onto Opal, her daughter, and then her grandsons through neglect. So Opal has trauma through Jackie's experience stepping in to be Jackie's caretaker, and then the caretaker of Jackie's grandchildren. And the story even goes on to explain how violence affects Opal when she smacked Ronald with a baseball bat so that he couldn't do anything to Jackie. It haunted her until Lucas took her back to see if he was alive or not. And then, even then, her trauma is unresolved because she wasn't sure if she was relieved or dissatisfied that he was alive. Which also, this is another bad moment that Opal relates to being Indian, and in turn, inflicts trauma onto Orville as he has a desire to learn about being Cheyenne. So we'll talk about adult influences or the lack of influence as an important factor to our character's traumas. Octavio was processing his emotions because of the loss that came from his uncle's actions. Although they had a heartwarming talk, the best thing that his grandmother could do for him was help him create a medicine box to contain a curse, which the curse is also a metaphor for trauma that he's inherited from the family. So I think it's important for their culture, but this adult influence isn't really giving him the nurture that a person in his experience probably needs. And he also, we know, has no mother or father, and he's really just left on his own. In Violence, we explored how Jackie and Opal's traumas bleed into Orville's narratives. Another trauma that can be understood from this as an inheritance is a loss of trust in the family. This is explained as Opal is always checking up on what they're doing on their phones, and Orville has already started to hide things from her, even though it's innocent and he just wants to use the regalia. It's still something that shows that they have no trust. All of the characters have also lost a family member. Edwin didn't know his dad growing up. He's in his 30s in the story. Tony's mom is in jail, and he was also raised by his grandmother like the boys. Calvin doesn't have his mom, and even that relationship was strained because she had bipolar disorder. Dean lost his uncle and grew up with only his mom. So lost family is a driving point in Tommy's story, and I think we as humans understand that there's a lot of trauma that comes from not having all the pieces that you feel like you should have in a family. The story unfolds a lot by what has happened to our characters, but gives us little insight to how they process and get through these hardships besides through alcoholism. Except Edwin, who has a suffocating mother. This is an important point that I'll get back to in a little bit. But what I'm trying to come across is emotional neglect is important to the trauma of our characters' narratives, if you think about how their stories could be rewritten if they had better support in their lives. All of the traumatic influence we've discussed so far lead into the themes of mental health in the novel. Calvin's narrative is more overt telling of the effects of mental health when he talks about the effects of dealing with a person with bipolar disorder like his mom and his sister Maggie, and how he even has it too. Maggie needs medication to be stable, and he's bipolar as well, but he's not medicated. So what does that imply about Calvin's experience? Issues with mental health translate into drug abuse. We have Tony, Octavio, Calvin, Charlos, Jackie, Harvey, who are heavily involved with drug use and alcohol. Our characters also experience trauma because of their circumstances by growing up in poverty and not having resources for healthcare and things like therapy and counseling. They turn to self-medication. An important thing to know is the trauma the characters feel from their native identities as well. Just like Opal, many of the other characters feel like their lesser experiences are because they are born as Native Americans, and it's like a curse, like Octavio's case. The way the characters see themselves is a repeating conflict through their stories that piece all the traumas together into their experience because they are Native or not Native enough. Along with that, there are other binaries they walk between. Tony focuses on his fetal alcohol syndrome and how people think he is dumb. He's actually a bright kid and is shown to be resourceful and a good businessman with his drug endeavors. He walks between unintelligent and smart, but he knows he's intuitive, which is a different kind of smart than he's comparing himself to. Jackie walks between being an alcoholic and sober. There are many times in her narrative when she's counting how long it's been since she's had a drink, or what was the longest she was able to make before breaking again. But she is more than just an alcoholic when we see she is a brave woman who can confront her rapist and then even find humanity in him and what he did to her. The revelation of Octavio's past as well shows that he kind of walks a line between good and bad. Although he's not necessarily good, you can't say that he's completely bad either, because you can see that he does care about his grandma and even the compassion that he shows to his uncle after everything that he's put him through. I also mentioned Edwin having a suffocating mother as something I wanted to revisit earlier. If we analyze Edwin's character compared to the others, although, yeah, he grew up not knowing his dad, Harvey, he still has opportunities that they don't, like an education. It's like he's on the other side of the binary line from them. I feel like Tommy uses his character to contrast that the experience is still not the best if these Native American narratives had more. This is important because there is about the solving that any urban Indian, and really anybody for that matter, is either this or that. Here we're visiting our trauma chart with the character and theme explorations we've just done, and as you can see, they're all connected in some way. This is a good way into a good way to segue into how Tommy uses postmodernism to effectively thread so many narratives together as one story. So all of these characters and all of these themes, there's a lot of pieces that come together. And then just to go over the definition of postmodernism, it's a reaction to and rejection of modernism. Modernism tried to establish universal theories about history, like a scientific approach to reality. Postmodern is skeptical of those theories because humans don't follow a linear progression. What we think we know as freedom and liberty is just shifts. I got that from somewhere I'll cite it. There is obviously fragmented, but another postmodernism concept Tommy uses is pastiche. A pastiche is alluding to the act of piecing things together, as in the case of a collage. It allows the author to rate the past in order to set up a sense of dialogue between it and the present. The different narratives of each urban Indian are pastiches. Opal and Jackie's fragments visit their past as children into the age of being grandmothers. Their stories combined with the boys gives the reader a sense of a long passing of time, and they're there, and a way to understand why the present is how it is, like why Opal is taking care of the boys. Octavio's narratives intersects with Calvin and Tony, and this makes the plans for the powwow feel longer than just a few pages as well. I think of how there is actually kind of a short novel, but it just feels like there's so much time that goes by because of the way Tommy writes it and how all of the stories connect. And the narratives become a unified collage, as some really wouldn't exist without another, in the case of Orville and the boys, and others are heavily impacted by each other's, in the case of Calvin's distress through his narrative and how Tony deals with Octavio as well. Tommy also uses Tony. Tommy also uses pastiche to introduce elements of gang violence, a story about families, and then Native history and culture. And to be a bit more specific about how a pastiche works, the interlude on its own is a pastiche. It begins with the gathering of Native Americans from all places, and then it talks about blood. And then all of a sudden, we're listening to a story about a man who's been thrown overboard a boat. And then he begins talking about the inheritance of last names and labels from colonizers. And then he finishes off with talking about shooters in a school shooting. The interlude feels like a revelation of the point Tommy wants us to get, and is also a warning of what is to come. That's the power of a pastiche, connecting elements and ideas that don't seem to be connected, but work to make a more powerful message as you understand each piece alongside the next. So we'll talk about how it connects, even though the way that I stated it doesn't seem like it connects. Focusing on the gathering of a powwow does two things. It keeps us grounded to the story currently unfolding, but also gives the importance of a powwow to Native Americans and what it means to them in exploring their culture and their heritage and celebrating each other. His transition to blood is connected to a sense of identity because he uses it to allude to how the Native American bloodline must go on, and even if it's subject to be used to identify how Indian they are. It also brings a subliminal awareness to danger, blood, dangerous. When he moves on to last names, you should be making the connection of bloodshed and colonization of Native Americans, as he strikingly closes with the experience of a school shooter, the fear, the uncertainty, the rawness, and the reality that comes in that moment that it's happening. With everything that he has spoken about prior, we're meant to make the connection to the shooting of Indians and their genocide. The use of pastiche in the interlude is important because it serves as, again, a relevation to the themes that Tommy wants the audience to be aware of while reading there. And as we know, some of our characters are already scheming with guns, so he uses the interlude closing as a warning, a foreshadow. And then to understand how powerful the use of a pastiche is in Tommy's novel altogether, we have to remember that There is not just a story, but a historiographic novel. In the prelude, Tommy focuses on King Philip's War and how the Indian chief's head was put on a stick to display as a trophy. The use of this as a pastiche into There helps us understand the reality of the atrocities inflicted on Native Americans during colonization. This helps us experience the migration to Alcatraz and the displacement of all the characters feel in regards to their heritage deeper. Tommy's use of pastiche through historic stories, familial connections, gang activities, make it more than just a Native story, which drives his point that Native Americans are still here. And they're not the Indians in feathers and loincloths we think of. They're people just like us. What's important for us to understand is that their presence in modern society is wiped out purposely by a hegemonic culture who haven't done enough to remedy the genocide of their people. Tommy is bringing awareness to real issues in Native American culture that are cyclical because of the erasure of their narratives from the present. One element we're going to focus on is the rape of Native American women. So I do want to share a clip.
About a month ago, I was out at the Peace Point, and on our way back, we came across a pair of shoes and then a sweater and then this young, tall, indigenous woman. And she was distressed. You know, she had one of her pant legs rolled up. She wasn't dressed for the weather. She was in a tank top, and it was cold out, and I was so freaked out. And I was like, I can't leave her out here. You know, I was so terrified about something happening to her. It reminded me of my own story and, you know, the last like sexually violent thing that had happened to me. And, you know, I was under the influence, and I just know that, you know, there's times where people take advantage of that. And I almost didn't come back from that. By that time, you know, I had already went through a lot of sexually violent encounters. You know, I was like 24, and that was my fourth one. And so, you know, I just was like, I can do this. I can make it through this because this has happened, and I know that I can survive this. You know, I remember going to bed and putting my hands like over my ovaries and things, because I was wondering, you know, could I even have children after that? And I could not sleep at night, and I couldn't stay sober after that. You know, and I've had a long life struggle with addiction, and once that came, I lost control. And it's really hard to live with stories like that, and especially when you won't give voice to them or you won't tell anybody. And when I seen that lady, I just thought about, you know, the stories that she held that put her in that position, or, you know, the things that could happen to her. And I don't want any of those things to continue to happen in this area, or to happen to some of our young girls. You know, I have young cousins that are teenagers, and they're going to be women soon. And I have a lot of family within the communities, and, you know, I work with a lot of youth, and I just see them as these amazing young women and girls with all of this potential to be anything. And a part of that fight is just fighting for a world that sees them that same way, that they don't have to worry about those things happening to them, because, you know, it's a good chance people don't come back from that. And I'm grateful to be on this side of it, to have reclaimed my voice and my power so that I could do what I can when I can.
Whose story does this experience mirror? Jackie's narrative is how he threads the issue of the rape of Native American women into his story. Native American women are subjected to rape because Indian reservations don't have jurisdiction to prosecute non-natives. So here are some stats. Many Native women don't report their experience because nothing is done. However, things are changing, and reservations are pushing for their rights to prosecute crimes that are committed by anyone on the reservations, even if they're not Native. Although Jackie doesn't report her experience either, why is it important that Tommy tells her narrative this way? Because representation matters. It's very powerful for someone like Jackie to read her story, understand the consequences it can have on the psyche, and realize that it's not right, and speak up for themselves or even others. The more we speak up, the more we can make change. I want to share this clip to honor the power of speaking up for the vulnerable and calling things out how they really are.
This is a call to action to all women and mankind to not only acknowledge that rape of Native women is epidemic nationwide, but begin exploring the larger, harder questions of but how and why. Claim your part in this story, for every coin carries two sides. Where you can start is with our mistold history and American beliefs that over the centuries have normalized this violence Native women contend with when our fathers and sons choose them to sexually terrorize. We can no longer remain bystanders while the self-determination of Native women continues to be undermined. For the denial of their humanity measures the limitation of both yours and mine. You see, when Columbus sailed the ocean blue in 1492, he stepped foot upon indigenous land and declared, "You are Indians now, and in the spirit of me discovering you, we will commemorate the inception of this colonialism by allowing my syphilis-infected crew to rape you, and you, and you, and you. But don't fret, I do assure my God does approve. For in order to divinely found this nation's justifiably appropriated, shiny and new, you, indigenous women, are hereafter deemed enemy, antithetical to Western patriarchy, and therefore must endure, being targeted by sexual terrorism that upon generations of your granddaughters hereafter will ensue." With him, Columbus brought what his culture and religion knew, That is the subjugation of women's self-determination to ensure a place at the table for men to do whatever necessary to guarantee their hierarchical power and piece of the pie, carved out by Europeans who, having no idea this continent even existed, accidentally did arrive, and who hereafter were aghast to find the embodiment of very different principles, epistemologies, and frames of mind. Traditional systems of accountability that ensured rape did not have a presence in Native women's lives. For indigenous peoples observe the sacredness of women because we give life. Yet it is these same values that Europeans identified as scandalous ideologies that must be put to trial and crucified. And so, upon indigenous women's bodies, this war against the people was assigned. For what better way to devastate a society than by cutting off their lifeline? This is a call to action to all women in mankind to not only acknowledge that rape of Native women is epidemic nationwide, but begin exploring the larger, harder questions about how and why. Claim your part in this story, for every coin carries two sides. Where you can start is with our mistold history and American beliefs that over the centuries have normalized this violence Native women contend with when our fathers and sons choose them to sexually terrorize. We can no longer remain bystanders while the self-determination of Native women continues to be undermined. For when defending their humanity, there exists hope for both yours and mine. So why, in an era of today's citizens demanding righteous things like equal rights or taking Wall Street upon themselves to occupy, we have sadly overlooked this lasting heritage of genocide, founded upon the backs of violenced indigenous women, a legacy that today remains both very much intact and alive. Imagine living in a world where it is not a matter of if your body will be violated, but when and how many times. For according to current statistics, the United States Department of Justice finds 1 in 3 Native women will be raped at least once in their life, with a 3 to 12 times higher probability of enduring sexually violent crimes. Tell me, would you want your daughter to have to survive in a community where not only persistent rape, but a 20% higher rate of associated brutality resides? Could you cope with knowing that your mother is 10 times more likely than other women in this nation to meet the end of a day due to homicide? Would you find it democratic, egalitarian, or right for your love, your baby's mama, or your wife, who while being raped became 3 times more likely to be battered or murdered with a blunt object, gun, or knife, further defining the racial and cultural identity she, in contrast to her perpetrator, was born with and now lives by? For according to current statistics, the United States Department of Justice also finds 70% of these perpetrators, like Columbus's crew, remain both male and white. But this is not an attack upon you or you or you or you. I am not asking you to pick sides. No, I am instead presenting you with an opportunity to acknowledge that what I have just described is our American heritage that will be reconciled when coming to truth with the ways in which through our American heritage continues to be defined. Understanding that rape is inherent to colonialism removes the veil from our eyes, so we may better see the ongoing denial of indigenous women's basic human rights. This is a call to action to all women in mankind to not only acknowledge that rape of Native women is epidemic nationwide, but begin exploring the larger, harder questions of but how and why. Claim your part in this story, for every coin carries 2 sides. Where you can start is with our mistold history and American beliefs that over the centuries have normalized this violence Native women contend with when our fathers and sons choose them to sexually terrorize. We can no longer remain bystanders while the self-determination of Native women continues to be undermined. For the healing of their humanity measures the restoration of both yours and mine. Thank you.
So I want to bring forth a very powerful quote from that, I think you would call that a poem. Understanding that rape is inherent to colonialism removes the veil from our eyes so we may better see the ongoing denial of Indigenous women's basic human rights. I think that's really important for our lesson because it helps us connect exile, as she talks about colonialism, and well, I lost my thought, so I'm going to move on because I'm really deep in this video. You can see in the first video that she's not healed as she relives her experience with rape and sexual assault. And even when she explains that she remembers her fourth and last sexual assault, she tells us it's not something she knew she would get through because... she tells us it's something she knew she would get through because she had to before, not as something that that should have never happened. Due to this, Whisper from the TED Talk says, imagine living in a world where it's not if your body will be violated, but when and how many times. The through-line connection of inheriting trauma from our past and the violent tragedies against Native American women is how we cannot reclaim a pain that was not acknowledged, and we cannot return from a past that we never left.